Hello, my name is Pierotte. I am a candidate for the ASU Master's Degree Program. This is the defense of my research paper created for our History 597 capstone portfolio. The title of my paper is Meet the New Boss, Same as the Old Boss, Native Perspectives on the Fall of the Aztecs and the Rise of the Spanish. This paper was originally created for my History 591 course in Latin American history for Dr. Casey. So as you can tell from our intro, my topic was the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire and the subsequent colonization of Mesoamerica by the Spanish. The scope of my paper is basically covering from the arrival of Cortes and the Spanish conquistadors through the fall of Tenochtitlan and the first century or so Spanish settlement in Mesoamerica and the Yucatan. My basic thesis was to try to explain why natives were at first willing to ally with the Spanish against the Aztec, and then later seek a path of accommodation and cooperation. My basic finding was that natives were not the passive victims that some histories have portrayed them as, but actually made choices based on their own self-interest, whether that was creating military alliances or cooperating with the Spanish in such a way that they were able to adapt and retain their own unique cultural identity, especially their social standing and their religious practice. Since I was basically looking at how the Native Americans were able to create a cultural synthesis with the Spanish conquerors, I decided to adopt a comparative approach by looking at pre-Hispanic systems versus the Hispanic systems or Spanish systems, which grew out of those. And for comparison, I looked at three key areas. First, why so many tribes, particularly the Tlaxcalans, were willing to ally with the Spanish and actually help them take a large role in the defeat of the Aztec Empire, and then how they were able to integrate themselves into the political and economic systems established by the Spanish, and then finally how they were able to sort of blend together their own religious traditions with the Catholicism and Christianity that the Spanish were bringing with them to New Spain. So I relied on several sources for this. My first was Diego Muñoz Camargo, who was the author of Historia de Tlaxcala. He was a mestizo. He had a Spanish father and Indian mother, and his father had actually been one of the original conquistadors, and his mother and wife were members of the Tlaxcalan nobility. So this gave him a unique perspective as someone who actually did straddle both worlds and live between both cultures. Also, for the conquest, or for the native perspective on the conquest, I turned to Bernardino de Sahagún, who was a Franciscan friar, missionary priest, and ethnographer who studied Aztec beliefs, culture, and history, actually learned the Nahuatl language, and then brought all of that together in what he called the Historia General, or general history, which included the Florentine Codex, which again gives sort of the native perspective on their participation in the Spanish conquest. Other sources I included were Diego de Landa, who is perhaps more infamous for having suppressed Mayan religious heresies and burned many of the Mayan codices, but he did write Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, which again provides documentation of both the Yucatan, both the Mayan religion and culture, while at the same time preserving some of their language and hieroglyphs. And finally, there was Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo y Valdez, who was actually writing from the perspective of the colonization of the Caribbeans, the Indies, but did provide some valuable insight into, again, the sort of blending of native and Spanish culture. Where I feel my research fits into the historiography, I was drawn to the research of two important historians, one being Inga Clendenin, who was the author of Ambivalent Conquest, and the other being Matthew Restall, who is the author of Seven Myths of Spanish Conquest. And they both wrote from this perspective that, again, the natives were not necessarily passive victims, but actually modified their own way of life and incorporated elements of Spanish culture into their own traditions. For instance, Clendenin argued that the Maya were actually able to maintain their pre-Hispanic vision of the universe and tended to equate Spanish conquest with pre-Hispanic conquest, that there was the cyclical nature of the universe, and that the Spanish would eventually be driven out. One of Restall's big arguments was that, again, the Spanish conquest could not have happened without the assistance of natives, that they really did join with the Spanish for their own reasons and tried to remain as autonomous as possible even in the years following the conquest. He also rejected this myth of native desolation, that the natives did not sort of fall into this depression or despondence, but instead tried to maintain their economic and social life through resilience and adaptation, and even try to improve their station within the Spanish conquest. And for that reason, that's why you'll see on a lot of these slides, I'm including sort of this comparison of the pre-Hispanic culture, like here we see the marketplaces and the similarities between them, the types of maps that were drawn with native assistance and native help. And here again, we see the blending of mestizo culture, the religious traditions, even the modern flag of Mexico containing the Aztec symbology. And that's where I feel my contributions are strongest, that again, the natives did not necessarily view this in the same cataclysmic way that we, from our modern perspective, would think that they would. That again, the rise and fall of empires, the cycle of conquest and assimilation was already well established, as it was well established in other parts of the world. And so, as the common people, they simply looked at the situation and figured out ways that they could actually thrive within this system, adapt to the system, and preserve their own unique characteristics. So that was one thing I was trying to do, was to overcome this sort of victim narrative that has become so prevalent when looking at the European conquest, and also push back against what I see as something of an imposition of modern viewpoints. Looking back at the conquest from today, we think we want these people to resist, we want them to fight back, but in truth, from their standpoint, that didn't make as much sense, or it wasn't going to be as beneficial to them as simply finding ways that they could accommodate themselves to this new system, wait the Spanish out, and again, look forward to that day when, again, the Spanish, as all conquerors had in their vision of the universe, would be driven out and their own self-rule would be reestablished. And though it took many centuries, of course, that did come to pass. That Spanish rule in Mexico did come to an end in the 1820s. You had the reestablishment of this mestizo culture, which is now so prevalent in Mexico, and again, seen in this incorporation of the Spanish traditions, yes, but also many of those native traditions and beliefs and practices are still very much there. Were I to use this paper to build upon my research later, I think I would try to take a more inclusive approach by trying to incorporate some additional native sources. I think it could also benefit from perhaps some more specific examples. I did, given the subject matter, take a rather broad approach, but I'm sure there are some local histories and other more specific case studies that could add to the arguments that I was trying to make. Further, I think it could benefit from a more comparative history with other conquest narratives, and attempting to sort of put the Spanish conquest of Mesoamerica in context of other conquests of indigenous peoples by larger empires. I thank you for considering my defense and considering my candidacy for the ASU Master's Program, and I wish you well. Thank you.